History Things podcast, a conversational approach to discussing social, industrial, maritime, music, and military history. Join us and our special guests as we dive down the rabbit holes of your favorite stories from the past. Follow the History Things podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or online at Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be sure to leave a review and a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Pat and Parker are coming right up. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the show.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the History Things podcast. I hear fife and drums. Parker, welcome to the show. It's the ambassador from Maine. How are you, buddy?
Oh, doing great. Do
you hear the fife and drums?
The fife and drums.
Where are we?
We must be somewhere.
We're back in the 1700s. We're back in the 18th century to talk about one of our favorite topics.
Really?
War of Independence. Let's go,
so
baby. USA. I'll tell you what, though. We're here to talk about a pretty interesting topic about the War of Independence. We're actually here to get into something our American audience might not really care too much about. But you know what? Listen up, because it's good to know things. We're here to talk about the British prisoners of war. And to do that, returning to the show, technically, actually, as a first-time guest, but returning to the show, is Ian MacDougall. I feel like I should have called you Lord Ian MacDougall, something at the front of it. But Ian, welcome back. How are you, friend?
Doing well. Thanks so much for having me on. This is exciting.
Dude, we had you on with Travis. You had a little cameo there with Travis Shaw, who our listeners have probably just finished digesting his episode on Maryland and the Revolution here midsummer. But we, right at the end of that episode, we had you jump on and kind of dish a little about, the War of Independence. And we found out that your thing, as you said, was British POWs.
Yeah, right now anyways. Yeah.
Right now. I feel that. Ask me tomorrow what I'm working on.
Right.
So anyway, first of all, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, how you got into history, what's, the origin story stuff, and then tell us how you came to British POWs being your right now kind of thing. It's kind of a niche topic.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in history. I've been reenacting since I was a little kid. My mom was a reenactor, took me to everything, French and Indian War, American Revolution. I grew up in Williamsburg, so there's really no way around that.
Right. That's a cool place to grow up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was in the Fife and Drum Corps there.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Got really involved in living.
Are you on the recording we just played? By the way, that was the Colonial Williamsburg Fife and Drums. Are you on that recording?
No, I'm not. And I'm actually not on that recording. I was in that Fife and Drum group. And actually, I'm really glad that you did play that tune. For those who might not know, the tune that was just played is called The World Turned Upside Down.
Yes.
Ooh. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But
nice.
That is the tune that has had a big cultural impact. A lot of people say that is the tune that was played at the surrender at Yorktown because the British saw that the world had essentially turned upside down.
Right.
It was a song that was originally written in the 1640s, I think, for like parliamentarians who were upset with.
Are you about to tell me this song didn't get played? Are you about to tell me this song didn't get played?
It did not.
You can break the news now, and then we'll come to it.
Highly unlikely that it did play.
So we don't get to do that awesome return diss of Yankee Doodle? Does that not happen?
No, I unfortunately not. If you're a fan of Turn, Washington Spies, I'm afraid that probably didn't happen.
I'll tell you what, right? So real quick before
tell us about what you're drinking.
I am enjoying a delicious Moxie from my friend in New England.
That's right.
A giant
That's
Moxie?
right. I forgot. Parker has
What?
to. He's obliged as the ambassador from Maine to
What does that sound like?
acknowledge the official,
wow.
unofficial sponsor of the show, which is Moxie.
Crisp.
Get some.
Please sponsor him so he'll stop doing that. But so you were talking about Turn there, and I was about to say it's like always worth saying. Like I love Turn, but like working in the 18th century, like it's one of those things where you love it and you're like,
yeah,
You know,
You got to leave it at you love it.
Right. It's a great show. I'm glad it got people excited into history. I was actually on the show for several episodes. Yeah, I'm a drummer in the background. So.
Nice.
But anyways, that it's a very interesting song because it's kind of remembered and it's part of this American story as such an important, incredible song. And it's the tune that people talk about with the British surrender. And that's kind of the subject today is surrendering of British troops. I'm going to be talking mostly about British prisoners, German prisoners, Loyalist prisoners in Virginia. Like I said, I'm from Virginia. I grew up in Williamsburg. I worked at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for many years, loved it. I currently work in the Northern Virginia Piedmont area. So if you're not familiar with the Virginia region, Northern Virginia region, it's kind of at the tippy top of Virginia, just south of the Maryland border, right along the Potomac in a place called Loudoun County.
Yeah.
all right.
Where there wasn't a lot of fighting that took place. Northern Virginia is not a place that you're going to see a lot of the actual fighting. Most of that's going to be happening in two different areas. And we're kind of in a sweet spot where there is no fighting.
Sure.
So you've got a lot of that war being fought along the coast. You've got the King's Highway, right, along that east coast running from Boston to Charleston, I think.
Yep.
And that's kind of, before the war, a major trade route. It's travel route. Everyone is going up and down that road. Then in the west, you've got the Great Wagon Road, which kind of runs from, I guess, Pennsylvania down almost to Georgia. So you've got these two routes. And then you have all this shipping that's going up and down the Atlantic along the coast. But during the war, none of that stuff that's happening along the coast can really happen with much ease, right?
In relation to like modern day Route 15, how close to that is that?
Great question. So actually, much of the Carolina, it was called the Old Carolina Road.
Okay.
In some places called it the Great Wagon Road. Much of modern Route 15 today is that exact road. Yeah.
Nice.
It's probably parts of it are probably several thousand years old.
Do they make you have your headlights on as you go through the area?
This is the King's Highway. Turn on your headlights.
Show some respect for the king.
So during the war, a lot of that travel that usually happens along those eastern routes just simply can't happen. And so this western route that we're talking about, modern day, in our area, around the Frederick area of Northern Virginia, that Route 15 is going to see an explosion of travel, both through, refugees who are leaving areas of battle in New York, New Jersey, the Carolinas, going back and forth. Trade, again, is going to be forced to go along that road. Troops and supplies are going to be going through this area as well. And then, of course, prisoners of war. As the war is being fought, we're collecting up prisoners, British, German, Loyalist troops. There's really nowhere to put them. And we're going to get into that in a second as well. But that's kind of why we're talking about this region in Northern Virginia.
Real quick, when you say we, I've seen your living history credentials. You wear a lot of British red. When you say we, you are talking about the U.S., though, right?
Yes, I am. Yeah, we're talking about the American rebel.
He suddenly just pulls out his MI5 badge.
Listen. During the War of Independence discussion is when I turn into the Uber patriot. I leave that the rest of the time elsewhere. It's not my thing. But you know what? We beat the king.
Yeah.
No,
we did. We did.
We did. Tease you a bit because you look incredible in almost every British kit I've ever seen you wear, and the only kit I look good in is my British Highlander kit, the P.O.W. thing I get to do at the fort. So I'm like, is there just something about it? Should we be saying we like Crown Forces? We
sometimes depending on what you're wearing.
That's right, exactly. All right, so when does the P.O.W. use of this area uptick? When does all that stuff, I guess that was a weird way of just asking, like, when does this story really become relevant to the Continental Army of the United States? Because we do a lot of losing in this war and a lot of retreating and a lot of maneuvering. So there's not a lot of massive incarceration of our opposition troops like British forces. So Saratoga happens. Right. Suddenly we have a very different conversation. Is it that moment?
No, so you're going to see prisoners, and I'd love to dive into some of the actually earlier prisoners that you're going to see in Virginia and then in the Northern Virginia area, and then we're going to get into some of those big moments.
Okay.
So first I thought it'd be great to kind of talk about, or at least mention who it is that we're actually talking about that are being captured, right?
Okay. Yep.
You've got German troops, English troops, or British troops, Loyalists, you've got Native Americans, and then women and children that are following that army as well. Right?
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Absolutely, yeah. So the British Army, obviously made up of Irish, English, Scottish, lots of Scottish troops, Welsh troops as well. So that's obviously the bulk of the army. There's something like 50,000 British troops on American shores. So obviously they're going to make the bulk of it up, but obviously the British are dealing with a global war.
Sure.
Not just here in the colonies, especially as it gets larger with the French alliance, the Spanish, the Dutch get involved. Yeah. So they're going to make contracts with German principalities, which are going to bring thousands of actual German troops to American shores as well. So places like Hesse Castle, that's bringing in like 19,000 troops.
Is that your Hessian troops?
Yeah, that's what we kind of know them colloquially as Hessians.
All of them, but they're not, right?
They're not all.
Right.
The vast majority are, but
right.
There's small German states. Obviously, Germany is not what we know it is today. It's these small principalities of Waldeck, Brunswick, Ansbach, Bayreuth. I think 30,000 in all. About 19,000 of them are actually Hessians.
How come Christopher Walken doesn't wear the big hat?
Right.
In Sleepy Hollow, he's supposed to be this terrifying Hessian, right?
Because you need to
he's supposed to be
know
like a
it's him.
Hessian cavalryman.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, they make him out to be like the British hired him to single-handedly quell the rebellion type of vibe.
Right.
Which, and then like that's
totally
kind of how
evil too.
Yeah, like he's scary, right?
Yeah.
But like, how come he's not wearing the big hat?
Right.
Like
I don't know.
I feel ripped off.
Well, the best part is he's supposed to be a Hessian cavalryman, but there's only, and this is really nerdy, but there's only one regiment of Hessian dragoons, I think, that fight in America, and the only time they fight, they're dismounted. So they're not on horseback.
Wow.
Yeah, dude. So if you were taking Sleepy Hollow seriously, don't.
Because that was
Don't.
And that's actually great because we're gonna get into like perceptions
Great.
of these troops and like how they're treated is based on how they're perceived nationally.
Because here's why that's important. Like, no BS. My first exposure to Hessian troops was Christopher Walken in Sleepy Hollow. Because I was like, they called him, like, remember they're telling the ghost story, and he's like, he's a Hessian. And then I was like, what the hell is that?
A bloodthirsty.
Yeah, and I like looked it up expecting them to be like psychopaths. And I was like, oh, they're just like really good soldiers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Emperor Palpatine was in that movie, was he not?
I think he was. Yeah.
I think Palpatine actually was.
I think he was
a Hessian.
I think he was in that movie.
Are you talking about the actor?
Oh, he's in the Notary Hardenbrook. I think that's who he is in that movie.
Yeah.
All right, that's enough nerding out of you, Parker.
All right, fine. See you guys
We're 2 seconds from a Star Trek reference, and we're off the rails.
Well, on that topic,
Nope,
how many
no.
lights are there?
No. All right, Ian, the floor is yours.
Great. So you've got those German troops that we just discussed. You've got the British troops. You've got lots of Native Americans. Remember when I talk about this kind of sweet spot that we're in, where all the trade is going through Western Maryland, Western Pennsylvania, Northern Virginia. There's a war going on in the West, up in the Ohio country, New York, way down in the Carolinas eventually. That's being fought with Native American nations that are aligned with the British government. The vast majority of Native Americans are going to be fighting with the British. Reason being, they've got treaties with the British. They know the British government. They've been working with them for a long time. And if the Americans take over, are they going to respect those same treaties?
I wonder if they've also got that kind of chip that a lot of the provincials that they've been directly fighting with, especially in the recent years, are now the rebels.
Yeah.
It's like, we've just been fighting, like, you guys directly. Like, we're not going to take your side. Like,
That's a good point.
Like,
no. Really, really good example of this. You've got the proclamation line of 1763,
right,
which prevents colonists from moving west west of the Allegheny Appalachian Mountains. And Virginians and Pennsylvanians are actually already breaking that. They're going over. There's a war fought by Virginians in 1774.
You guys were kind of jerks about that, though.
Yeah.
George and company were like, but like, there's a fortune out there. Well, I'm glad we're talking about like this perception, because I don't think people really understand. And because it's my main profession, but like the treaties, the relationship that pre-exists with the English, and how it largely was not in our favor with the native peoples here during our own independence war. Because, the site I work at, has a treaty that happens there, a localized treaty. Right. And one of the guys that's involved in that, 20 years later, is a loyalist leading a mixed Cherokee rebel force in Charleston. Yeah. And it's like, wait, and you're like, the Cherokee 20 years later are still with them, and people don't really think about that. So I just whenever you bring
Sure.
it up, it's like it's a very important topic because
Absolutely, yeah.
the
And
provincials pissed them off.
so there's this war going on in the West, and there's this war going on in the East, right? The British Army's moving all up and down. They've got the greatest navy the world's ever seen, and they basically have control of the ocean and the coast. So everything is squashed into this middle part of these colonies, and so that's where you're going to see a lot of this really crazy movement. Now, we were talking about perception. How you were treated as a prisoner of war is really based on where you are when you're captured, what time of the war it is, and your background, right? So, really good example, in 1775 or 1776, there are some Highlanders captured from the 71st Regiment of Foot, Fraser's Highlanders. You're probably familiar with
Yeah,
them.
they come. They're at my site imprisoned at one point.
Exactly. So there is one of the soldiers writes actually about his experience in Boston. He's taken prisoner, and Boston is the hotbed of the Revolution, right? It all starts there. The angriest, most rebellious colonists are there, and so when he's traveling through Boston, this is what he has to say. So I've got a great quote here. It says, "On our journey, no slaves were ever served as we were. Through every village and town and hamlet that we passed, the women and children, and indeed some of the men amongst them, came out and loaded us with the most rascally epithets, calling us rascally cutthroat dogs, murderers, and bloodhounds. But what vexed me the most was their continually slandering our country of Scotland, on which they threw the most infamous invectives. To this abuse they added showers of dirt and filth, with now and then a stone. We complained to those who had us in their charge, but it was useless."
Why do I got to bring Scotland into it?
Right.
Like, what are they doing?
So that's what's really interesting. Like, as a Scottish prisoner in Boston, you would be treated poorly because of the propaganda machine that's hard at work. So there's a really I wish I could show it to you, but there's a famous cartoon published at that time, and it's a depiction of Boston in 1775.
Okay.
It shows a lot of the British leaders, like the Judge, Lord Advocate, and war ministers and things like that, telling these Highlanders to burn Boston to the ground. And in the background, you see this burning city, and you even see English soldiers in the foreground of this cartoon dropping their guns in astonishment. They're in fear of these bloodthirsty, wild Highlanders that are just tearing through the city. So stuff like that is going around. And I mean, even if you look at our Declaration of Independence, you'll see certain words, certain phrases that are being used against, the British. I've got a couple great quotes here as well.
I love quotes. I'm so glad you came.
I know.
on today.
Yeah.
I'm so
Came prepared.
glad.
I
I'm
came
so
prepared.
pumped up, dude.
I love it.
Yeah. So here's one. He is at this time, that's King George, he is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with the circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. So he's talking about Hessian troops, German troops, right? As bloodthirsty foreign mercenaries. He also talks about enslaved people that are, and we're going to talk about this in a second as well, but he's going to talk about enslaved people who are fighting for the British as well, and Native Americans. They go on to say, he has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
So it sounds like total war.
Yeah.
I also like that he said a domestic disturbance among us. I like when people think that the American Civil War is the first time that we had this whole fighting to keep slaves conversation. Right. Oh my goodness. This has been a season of me just poking the bear. It just must be the atmosphere I live in right now. But I'm like, I need to fight somewhere.
Yeah.
But like, I think in the reality is, there's a lot of perceptions on the whole about the War of Independence that we're not going to totally go into today because we're talking prisoners. But the natives were one thing that we talked about too. How how African American people would relate to the revolution and whose side would you pick, and sort of that thing. It's like there's a much different conversation than the one most of us grew up with that needs to be had. So I'll just poke that fucking bear. Eh?
Poke away.
Anyway, go ahead.
So that's how people are feeling about the enemies that they're going up against, right? A huge propaganda machine at work, turning these people essentially into monsters, which is very common in war, right?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Dehumanizing your enemy to make it easier to kill them.
That's
And that's going to have a pretty decent effect on how you're treated as a prisoner in certain areas. Now, I mentioned that's one wing. Places like Boston, where this propaganda is fully at work.
right.
Yeah.
Where you have a population that's really eating it up and looking for any reason to fight, right? Not that Bostonians are like that anymore.
No, they've changed. Their ways have. They're such a calm people, such a kind and
And to
considerate
prove
people.
that, why don't you walk through the town wearing that?
I'll
that
just
hat?
walk down Lansdowne Street wearing this hat.
Yeah.
We'll just see how it
Faneuil
goes.
Hall. Just walk in there.
Yeah.
Best of luck.
Sometimes you
So-
wanna go.
So I also mentioned loyalists. If you were going to fight in the British Army, being a loyalist is largely based on where you are as well. So if you're in a coastal area where this war is being fought, like if you're in Tidewater, Virginia, and you're a loyalist, you've got loyalist sympathies, you'll probably join up with the British Army because of the convenience of it. In our area that we're talking about in the Northern Virginia Piedmont, there's plenty of loyalists, but none of them are speaking up.
So this is it true? There's a quote, and it's attributed to John Adams, where he basically says that like a third of the people wanted their own country, a third of the people wanted England to rule it, and a third of people just didn't care.
Yeah,
is that true? Do you think, or is that?
I wouldn't say it's really a 33%.
That's a
of the
nice
country.
political quote.
It's a very good quote.
Right.
It's more like 15 to 20% of Americans are active loyalists at this time.
Okay.
And
so
substantially lower.
Yeah.
does this conversation really center more around economics and status? Like, where you're nearer to the coast, you're more tied to the economy of England, right? Like the port economy, shipping, things like that. The further into the interior, you're a lot more reliant on yourself and your neighbors than necessarily the coastal imports.
Well, I mean,
that definitely could be
the coastal people would find that out during the Jefferson administration, during what was escalating into the war, what would be the War of 1812.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because he ends up shutting down a lot of that shipping.
Well, when you mentioned they're not speaking up, I'm just like, it's probably like, I wonder if it's because more farmers are just like, I don't need a king. I'm doing my own thing, right?
Sure.
Right. They're far removed from it.
Right.
But they exist.
Sure, for
one of the best resources we have about Loudoun County in Virginia on the Revolution is actually from a loyalist. A man named Nicholas Cresswell keeps a diary of his experience, and he's from England, so it's natural that he's a loyalist.
Sure.
But he moved to America, he moved to Virginia, and is kind of just traveling around, and he lives in Leesburg, which is kind of the county seat of Loudoun, and is a very revolutionary area. Loudoun is very revolutionary. There's not a ton of loyalists. If there are, again, they're not speaking up. They're raising up troops. So once we get into 1775, which is kind of the period we're talking about now, when the war begins, they're raising up troops left and right. And loyalists are not going to be treated with civility. He actually also writes, I've got another quote.
Yes!
So he writes in his diary what the experience is for people like him who might be loyal. He says, "This is the happy fruits of independence. The populace are grown so insolent that that if you do not tacitly submit to every insult or imposition they think proper, they immediately call you a Tory and think that if you have that stigma upon your character, they have the right, nay, they take it to even be a meritorious act to knock your brains out."
So can I say something a little
Yeah.
dark and ominous, Ian?
Yeah.
That sounds kind of familiar. Right. There's a bunch of people out there that are super patriotic that way today. I now wonder aloud how far off base they are from the original founding.
Certain ones, maybe not so much.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
but like this, the way you said that, right? Like it's funny to me because there's a whole hypocrisy to the founding of our nation. And again, that's a much deeper conversation, but we're founded on all these things like freedoms of this, freedoms of that, freedoms of even just having an opinion, right? But yet Tory newspapers are going to be burned. You speak up your mind just on the street corner, you're getting popped in the face.
Yeah.
And it's pretty wild, but we want freedom, but shut your face. Shut it if you disagree with me, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's definitely a dark moment
Yeah.
if you aren't on board. And that's why, we say 15 or 20%. It could be a little bit larger than that, but again, by and large, you're keeping quiet. If you're not in a loyalist hub, say the Tidewater area,
It's certainly a minority.
Yeah. So, let's see. There's about 25,000 loyalists that actively fight or support with the British Army. There's about 20,000 black or recently enslaved, formerly enslaved, free black people who are supporting the British Army militarily. That doesn't necessarily mean they're armed. They are in some cases, many of them in supportive roles, logistical roles.
And have they been promised freedom at this time if they join up?
Yeah, so that's what we're going to get into.
Okay, sorry.
So that I just wanted to cover kind of who we're all talking about. We're talking about loyalists, British, German, black soldiers. Obviously, one other that I didn't mention were the women.
Yeah.
So again, for every 10 soldiers that are in a company of troops, there's one woman usually in the British Army, in the German Army as well. And usually those are the wives of soldiers, and they provide a huge logistical supportive role to the army as well. They're doing, they're washing clothes, they're mending clothes, they're guarding baggage wagons, they're doing a lot of gardening. So are the soldiers. If you're in one place for a long enough time,
laundry is important. I mean, laundry is like critical to your health at this time.
Yeah. Disease kills far more. A story as old as time, right? Up until about like the First World War, I think.
Yeah.
Far more disease. Disease kills far more of these guys than any battle. And they know certain ways to keep clean, and laundry is a huge part of that.
Right.
I think they're cleaning their clothes once every 3 days, at least in the American Army in Virginia. That's what they're doing. So when we talk about these prisoners, it's important to kind of remember that everywhere that these prisoners are going, every trial, every tribulation, every hardship that they face, there are women following this, doing the exact same thing, and going through the same troubles. So it's rough for everyone around.
That's a sobering observation, and it's, again, something that we touch on in professional world as well, because I think people get lost in the mire of when you talk about war and soldiering and all this stuff. You just, again, you end up focusing on what is the traditional view of the warfighter, which is the man. Even though today it's a very different definition, but like, especially when we talk about these not ancient, but these past armies. So, but when you say you bring it home with like at work, we're like, by the way, among this number, there are a combined 550 women and children, and you can just hear a pin drop. Right. Everybody's like, what? So it's an important and sobering metric.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something to keep in mind when we talk about these stories.
Yep.
So that's kind of who we're talking about. And so, let's see, this will air in the summer.
Yeah. So you just break the fourth wall there. It's still winter.
So
it's batch recording, baby. We do it all in the spring. But yeah, this will be out. You guys, because I didn't even know we were going to do this episode until we sat down with Travis to do Maryland in the Revolution. Right. And I was like, all right, well, as soon as we can get this Virginia POW kind of conversation, that you guys are going to pair. So I think one of you comes out on the 2nd and one of you comes out on the 4th.
Okay.
I think.
In July?
Yeah, either way, you guys are all in the first week of July. So it'll be out this year.
That's the only reason I asked.
Happy Independence Day, everyone.
Yes, absolutely.
Get some.
This is airing in July. This is perfect timing.
Right.
July of 2025, we're talking about the summer that the American Revolution begins 250 years ago this year. So,
hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year.
That was really good.
God damn it, Parker.
That's a real quote.
I know.
Yeah. So, 1775. The spring of 1775 ushers in the American War for Independence. With those first shots fired at Lexington and Concord on April 19th, what happens in Virginia is a quick rippling effect. So, on April 21st, 1775, the British Royal Governor of Virginia sends British Marines and sailors into the public magazine, so government storehouse of gunpowder and weapons, and he removes the public gunpowder from that magazine. He's basically worried about a potential uprising.
That's a smart move if you're covering your butt.
Yeah, that whole spring,
that makes sense.
There have been armed companies of men marching around, training, drilling. Patrick Henry gives his famous Liberty or Death speech in Richmond in March. So it's pretty clear what's going on here.
Virginia's like, we're in this one.
I mean, besides, I'm assuming they heard those shots.
I
understand you heard them around the world, right?
Yeah. The word
that's an actual fact, man. That's actual fact.
It was that loud. Now, word arrives 10 or 11 days later, I think, in Virginia, and by then things have fallen apart completely.
Right.
So when the gunpowder is removed, there's this huge uproar. The militia companies start marching to Williamsburg. It's looking like war's on the horizon. And eventually later that summer, Lord Dunmore, the governor, and his family are going to escape out to the Chesapeake Bay. And when they do, they're going to start raising a military force to take Virginia back. So one of the first things they do in the fall of that year, Dunmore is going to publish what's known as Dunmore's Proclamation.
Okay.
And in that proclamation, he calls upon any free white, loyalists to come and join him in the city of Norfolk to create an armed force to take Virginia back. One extremely controversial thing he's going to do is declare freedom to any enslaved person living in a rebel household if they should do the same. So he's urging enslaved people to leave their masters, travel to Norfolk, get a musket in their hands, and fight for him.
Nice.
So imagine the effect that that's having on a lot of different people, right?
Yeah.
So for, Virginia is a huge slave economy.
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
Now, do rebels like it when people show up and try to take their slaves away?
They don't.
They don't?
They definitely don't.
Is that something that
as we will learn decades later, they still don't like
They
it.
still don't like it.
Right.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
I wonder what's
Fuck
going to
'em.
happen with that.
So this is a hugely controversial thing. It's actually something that Dunmore threatened to do earlier in that spring when the crowds of people are wanting that gunpowder that he removed to be returned. He threatens to reduce the capital of Virginia and Williamsburg to ash. He's going to burn the city down, and he's going to put an arm in the hands of every slave.
Nice.
And he ends up doing that, right? That's what he plans to do. And so you see this kind of cobbled together army in the fall of 1775 of white loyalist troops. They create a regiment known as, the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment. He creates this black regiment of loyalists called the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. And he's got a few British troops with him as well. And so we're going to see pretty quickly how you're treated as a prisoner is going to depend on what category you fall in.
Oh, man.
So over the next few months, there's going to be a series of battles fought. The first of which is going to be a big loss for Dunmore. It's the Battle of Great Bridge in December. A lot of British troops killed. I won't get into the whole details of it, but the Americans are successful. They defeat the British, and they capture a lot of prisoners. A lot of these black prisoners, a lot of these white loyalist prisoners, and a lot of the British troops as well. And they're brought into Williamsburg in a manner of ways. So the British troops, professional British troops, are marched under an armed guard into Williamsburg. Once they get there, they're kind of given the leave of the city. They're basically put under a temporary parole, meaning that they've kind of signed an agreement that they're not going to go anywhere, they're not going to do anything. They're actually allowed to take odd jobs when they're in the city. You can work for a black, if you've got a trade or
just
skill.
see a bunch of British soldiers just like milling about.
Yep, and it's a few dozen, so it's not a ton of guys, but they're basically given a leave of the city. The white and black loyalists, however, are going to be chained together, black to white, and marched into the city basically as a parade or a show of force, kind of a warning to those who might think about taking up arms for Dunmore. And once they're brought into the city, the white loyalists are sent to the public jail, and they're kind of chained up there. They're sent to the jail. They're living in pretty horrid conditions there.
Yeah.
And then the black loyalists, and this is kind of the darkest or saddest part. If you fell into that category, you're going to get the worst treatment. Many of them are, if they could find their former masters, they're returned to them. Some of them are going to be sold back into slavery in one way or another to benefit this new kind of fledgling Virginia government.
Right.
And others are going to be hanged. And then a few of them are going to be sent to a lead mine in Fincastle County, Virginia, so Southwest Virginia, and they're going to spend the entirety of the war toiling in a lead mine, producing lead that's going to go into musket balls for the American Army. So you can really see, based on who you were at that time, really depend. That's
What you can see right there, like what I'm getting from that is, one, the way they view the professional army is, we get it.
Yep.
You're following orders. You're doing your duty as soldiers. This is who we're fighting against. We get it. And then when it comes to black and white loyalists, with white loyalists, they're seeing it as like a neighborly or a brotherly betrayal.
yeah.
You bitch, you're one of us.
Right.
What are you doing? So, then they get that kind of extra sauce on their treatment. And then obviously, goes without saying, we have never had a great relationship with anybody that doesn't look like the founding fathers.
Yeah.
So, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be horrible.
Yeah. It's
You said the name of they were the Ethiopian regiment, right?
yeah. And
Do we know how they were treated when they were in the army? Like, do we know about their service record?
We
I
don't.
I know we're not going to go too far down.
We don't know a ton.
Okay.
Or at least I don't know a ton of them. There's many more folks out there who are way smarter than me about that. But I know many of them are going to be used as laborers. They're getting uniforms. I know that Lord Dunmore is writing to the British government in Boston, basically pleading for uniforms for his black troops.
Oh, nice.
So at the very least, he is, he's trying to equip
taking
them.
care of them.
Some of them are getting British coats.
Okay.
British. There are several accounts of British of these black soldiers being issued British regimental coats. Some of them are wearing kind of work shirts, overshirts that they painted on or stitched on the words "Liberty to Slaves," which is huge, right? I mean, that's
awesome.
That's a big step.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Yeah, the British are enabling this, by the way, just for the record again. The British are enabling this,
Yes,
not the
yes.
United States.
And I can't say for one moment it's an altruistic.
No, it's a war. It's this will help us.
Yes,
No,
absolutely.
for sure.
The British government knows just how powerful the slave economy is to, especially the southern states,
Right.
and mid-Atlantic.
So let me ask you one potential rabbit hole question before we continue. If it's too deep, we don't have to go into it.
Sure.
But when he does this, when Dunmore does this, how do the provincial governments, like the loyal governments that still exist in Georgia, in South Carolina, react to this? Like, you're doing what with your slaves? Like, because remember, when it comes to independence, as far as the continental side, the American side, like Thomas Jefferson writes up this draft and it's got all these references to slavery's evils, and the southern colonies are like, hey, delete that. Delete it right now.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, in this moment when Dunmore's like, all hands, quite literally,
Right.
How does South Carolina react to that? How does Georgia react to that?
It's a great question, and it's
Like, are you out of your mind?
Yeah,
Like,
it's a question I don't actually really have the answer to.
let's go.
I know that it essentially sets a precedent for the British Army. The British Army see that and go, wow, that worked.
Right.
And, I said something like 20,000 black soldiers serve in the British Army at one point or another. And time again after that, the British Army sets that precedent of, yeah, if you are an enslaved person, join us. You will get your freedom if you serve in the British Army. And many of them actually do. One thing and we're talking about POWs, but I will mention, for those black troops that are serving in the Royal Ethiopian Regiment that do get away with Dunmore, many of them live new lives in New York. At the end of the war, many of them moved to Nova Scotia. There's a huge black population that of formerly enslaved loyalist black troops and black loyalist supporters. A few of them actually set up a new colony in modern day Sierra Leone. So book travel,
wow, I didn't know
passage.
that.
They get passage to Africa and begin a new life there. So it's not all dark. There are ways out for some of these black troops that are fighting with Dunmore. But so that's kind of the start of this.
So we've had this public show, which kind of shows us how treatment is going to kind of separate
Yeah.
based on a number of variables.
Yeah, what hole you're going to fall in based on your background.
All right.
And this is a really confusing time because essentially we don't have any POW laws at the time. There's no Geneva Convention. There's kind of a general understanding that develops between the British and the American governments. Basically, the British at the start of the war say, you're all British subjects. If you're taking up arms against your king, you're essentially a criminal.
Right.
But they realize that they can't just hang every American prisoner, because once they start doing that, the Americans are just going to do the same thing. And
Right.
so the British end up taking the American POWs, mostly jamming them onto prison ships, which is an abysmal existence. I'd much rather be a British prisoner in American hands, just
And an
because,
American prisoner.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
You just don't want to be on a prison ship. As we have already discussed, disease is so prevalent.
So can we actually, are you going to talk more about prison ships, or are we going to, because I want to touch on something if you're not.
Sure, yeah. I wasn't going to talk too much about it, but
That's fine.
Just in how it relates to the prisoners that end up here.
No, and that's important because
please go
of,
ahead.
again, what we do at work every day. So
Right.
I want to give a shout out to a guy named Jacob Davis.
I love Jacob.
Right? Good friend of ours, good
Great guy.
researcher. So here's something he discovered in writing. Finally got to see it in writing just to kind of prove something we've always suspected, but never really put into interpretation. You can't interpret things directly if you don't know them, right? You got to be delicate. Right. So, knowing that, these prison ships are these abysmal, like beyond describable, abysmal conditions, and then you make the comment about you'd rather be a British POW than an American POW here. And he discovered, because we have this incredible lack of a Navy at the time, we can't really afford to use too many ships for prison hulks in the same way. Right. So we start looking for all these land-based places to accomplish essentially what's the same goal, is close confinement, too many people, limited food, things like that, like intentional sufferings. And he finally found in writing that the site we work at was being, basically intended to replicate a prison ship situation, minus the fact that it's an open air and they can't control the airflow.
Yeah.
But it was like one of those things that it was like, and it was twofold. One, we got to see for a fact that, it was an intentional, you can call it what you want. I'll just say it plain and simple. Intentional, not mistreatment, but intentional sort of hardships placed upon POWs because of how we were being treated. And two, because we don't have a Navy, we can't exactly go eye for eye. So every ship is kind of important, but it was just like, wow.
That's really fascinating. I haven't come across that in Virginia yet. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Sure. We're talking really Maryland, right?
Yeah. Maryland is pretty harsh on their prisoners.
Yeah, well, it's because they have nothing else to do in the war.
Right. At least if they're loyalists or British troops, they have a pretty abysmal experience. If you're German, and we'll get into this in a little bit, you have a slightly better experience.
We do that in 2 wars. Do you know that historically? Ask Travis about beloved Frederick County.
In
World War II.
Yeah, there's actually some German POWs in Loudoun County in Virginia as well.
Are there?
During World War II, but that's separate.
Separate episode.
Yeah. So the war has started. We've dealt with our first prisoners. You've got these British troops that you don't really know what to do with. Eventually, they actually get transferred or traded for other prisoners that Dunmore had taken.
Okay.
So those are the British troops. They go back into British lines, and kind of that's the end of it. But there's still no official POW camp in Virginia at the start of the war. There's really no recommendations from Congress about how to deal with prisoners, and so they're kind of flying by the seat of their pants and see what happens.
Right.
And they get their next opportunity in the spring of 1776. So in the early spring of that year, the British Army is going to start sending reinforcements to America headed for Boston, or at least they think they're headed to Boston. So we've got about 200 British troops, British soldiers, as part of the 42nd Black Watch Regiment, 42nd Highlanders, one of the most famous regiments in the British Army.
I think I have a Black Watch World War I Piper up there. Parker, can you grab that real quick? Because I know that Ian's also a World War I guy.
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah, you can bring him down here. I bought this guy in Hagerstown. I was just
incredible.
In an antique mall, and I was like, what the hell? I was like, that's awesome. So that's a Black Watch guy, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Look at that. So, but we're talking about guys that wear cocked hats, different.
Yeah.
Actually, they're probably not even wearing, they're probably wearing bonnets.
Bonnets and kilts, at least at the beginning of the war. So, these about 200 troops, two or three companies worth of men are on these transport ships bound for America. They're going across the North Atlantic, right? It is a trip that takes 6 to 12 weeks, right? And along their Atlantic voyage, there's a massive storm and a series of storms, actually, that last a few weeks on their journey. And during that storm, they get completely separated. All these ships get separated. And 2 transport ships called the Oxford and the Crawford get separated from the rest of their fleet. Now, there are ships that have their guns and their supplies and their ammunition on them, and then there are ships with men on them. So they are completely unarmed. The only thing that these guys have on the ships with them are little wooden drill muskets. Basically, I suspect to train and drill.
Stay sharp.
Right, yeah, stay sharp before they hit the American shores. So if they do run into the Americans, they're not going to be able to do much. Which, of course, is exactly what happens. There's a small group of ships under the command of a Continental Navy officer named Nicholas Biddle. He's from... Where's
this guy?
Yeah, he's from Rhode Island. I think he's headquartered out of Rhode Island, ships out of Rhode Island. And he comes across these British transport ships completely unarmed, unguarded, and I want to knock over your Moxie.
Yeah, you don't want to ruin our Moxie sponsorship.
So he pulls alongside these ships and essentially orders the crews to surrender, and of course they do. And so he gathers up the officers and the men and makes notes of everyone he's got, and starts sailing back to Rhode Island with this massissive prize, probably a huge smile on his face.
Man, and they're probably laughing their asses off. They're like, we cut all these Brits with these wooden guns.
Right. And kind of these American crews take over the ships to pilot them to Rhode Island. And while they're headed back to the colony, the Highlanders discover from the naval crews that are piloting the ships that Boston has been evacuated. So General Gage, the British Army, they've evacuated Boston. They have no idea where they are. And so with that in the back of their mind, another massive storm hits.
Oh, no.
And it separates Nicholas Biddle's ships from his prize. And so the Oxford, with its 200 Highland prisoners, is again separated from everyone else. And so these 200 prisoners...
But it's got an American pilot crew on it, right?
It does.
Oh, this is...
For now.
This is,
yeah.
this is about to turn into a terrible story.
Yeah, so the Highlanders retake the ship. They overrun the crew and force them to start sailing the ship south because they had heard from the crew that Lord Dunmore was operating with this force in Virginia.
Oh.
Now, by this point, this is spring of 1776. So Dunmore has suffered a series of defeats. At this point, he's kind of up the Potomac River, kind of doing some raids. He's not really sure what he's doing at this point, and is not really having a whole lot of success. But he's kind of left his base of operations at Norfolk along the coast and has gone up the Potomac, which is very unfortunate for him.
Yeah. Because
now this transport ship full of 200 professional British soldiers is sailing down to meet him, and he's not there.
Oh, good.
So they sail into the Capes of Virginia, and what they do find, obviously they've been told that Dunmore, news travels very slowly, they've been told that Dunmore is in that area, and they are traveling along the coastline, and they see all these armed troops on the beach, and they're like, finally we found Dunmore. And two boats row out to meet them, and they say, "Oh yeah, you're the British. You're our reinforcements. Come on shore." And these Highland troops, many of whom, by the way, do not speak English.
Right, they speak Gaelic.
They speak Scots Gaelic. Yeah.
Right.
So they've never set foot on American shores. They don't even know what an American essentially looks like. All they've seen is newspapers.
Right.
So they get off the boat, and these armed guys are like, "Oh yeah, thanks for coming on shore. You're our prisoner now." Right? So they're not Dunmore's men at all.
They're like, what?
They're like, wait, what the heck? And so these Highland prisoners get marched into Williamsburg, just like, the previous few months earlier.
Yep.
And these Highland prisoners are sent behind the governor's palace in Williamsburg. They camp on the governor's grounds until the Virginia government can figure out what the heck to do with them. And so they write to the Virginia delegates, our Virginia government, it's very, very new at this point, writes to the Congress basically saying, hey, we've got 200 British prisoners. What should we do with them? And they're talking about different ideas. They don't really get any solid word back from Congress. And so the delegates start to come up with some of their own ideas. There's a Loudoun County, actually the Loudoun County representative in the House of Delegates is a man named Levin Powell, who will later go on to found the town of Middleburg, which is kind of the capital of horse country in Virginia. But
oh, yeah.
That's a different story. But Levin Powell, who's kind of a leading revolutionary in Loudoun County, he says to the government, here's a great idea. Why don't I take all 200 of those Highlanders, and they could work on my farm and make me money? And the rest of the Virginia delegates basically say, well, no.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen. But you've got an idea of the fact that they could be helpful to the war effort. So they go to the Highland prisoners and they're like, look, some of you are weavers, some of you are shoemakers. These are all things that we desperately need to support the American army, to support Virginia. And so they're going to kind of draft out some of those prisoners who are willing to work in those trades. We have no idea if any of them volunteered to work on Levin Powell's farm in Loudoun County. I suspect they did not.
Right.
But at this point, with nothing else, the rest of the prisoners are just kind of sitting around. And so the Virginia government decides, okay, you know what we'll do? Split them up into groups of about a dozen each and send them out to the western counties of Virginia, and just they're the county's problem at that point.
Right.
And so they get sent out to the different counties of Virginia. About a dozen or so soldiers arrive in Loudoun County at the county courthouse, which is where these soldiers are to be housed. They're going to the county courthouses, and they're essentially living on the grounds of the courthouse until something else is to be done with them. And we don't know too much about what their experience is living amongst the community, but we do have a really great quote I'm going to grab here.
So while you're looking for that quote, desertions. I mean, these guys aren't in these tight-knit, tidy camps. Let me rephrase that. The camps are never tidy. But they're never in these theoretically tidy camps and things like that. Like, are people just bleeding away, into the darkness in the middle of the night?
It's a very common theme that, at least in Virginia, and I know in Maryland and in Pennsylvania, will carry on throughout the war, especially with those larger armies that we'll get into in a minute.
The site I work at gets put into play because they're tired of the desertions.
Yeah.
They're not getting out, and they're not going anywhere if they do get out where I am, right in Western Maryland.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering,
there's nowhere to go out there.
No, out there, there's nowhere to go. But I always, and again, if you want to hear my thoughts on that, come see me at my site. But I basically, when you're describing, this sort of, they don't know what to do with them, it's like, that's got to be obvious to everybody, not just the governments, but like the prisoners and the guards have all got to be like, nobody knows what the hell is happening right now. Yeah. So opportunistic people that don't want to be incarcerated, like they're melting away, right? Like, oh, I'm out of here when I can.
Right. Okay. And remember, these guys are traveling to the western counties of Virginia in June of 1776. That's where we're at.
Right.
We haven't even declared ourselves independent yet. We're not even essentially a country yet. So
we're not even officially in open rebellion. We're just kind of rising,
figuring out what it is yet.
Right.
So
we're unhappy.
Yeah. So
we want to start seeing other kings.
Yeah. And what actually
other congresses.
As part of that, what's really interesting is obviously we declare ourselves independent in July of 1776, but in August, that word will get to Loudoun County, and they're going to read the Declaration of Independence from the steps of the Leesburg Courthouse.
Oh.
Now, who's living on the grounds of the Leesburg Courthouse? A dozen Highland prisoners, barely of whom speak English.
Right. Like, what's
so
happening
imagine
here?
What that must feel like to essentially watch the formation of your enemy country right before your eyes.
And also not really understand that it's happening.
Yeah.
You're like, what are they saying?
Right.
Ian, hit me with that bottle opener, buddy.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
So, again, we don't know too much about what's going on with them. Some of them are going to be working on the farms and in the communities. It's great that you mentioned the fact that some of them just kind of melt into the countryside. That's definitely something we know happened. In 1778, supposedly, the majority of these Highlanders are transferred to Philadelphia and then exchanged back to the British Army. We know that doesn't always happen. We know that doesn't happen to a lot of the Highlanders that are here. There's a young guy in Amherst County, which is kind of southwest Virginia, central Virginia, a man named Angus MacLeod of the 71st Highlanders, who deserts the British Army right there in Amherst County, marries a wife, finds a wife, marries her, has children. The descendants of that family are still in Amherst, supposedly today. At least within the last 30 years.
That's the most Scottish name I've ever heard.
Angus MacLeod.
Like, you got a really Scottish last name yourself, but that dude's got a first and a surname.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that dude's just like that's Scottish.
Absolutely, yeah. So
he should be king.
Right. So some of these guys are melting into the countryside. They fall in love with the land that they're living in. Some do not. So that loyalist we mentioned earlier from Leesburg, Nicholas Cresswell, who keeps this diary, he actually mentions seeing some of these Highland prisoners later on in his journal. Yeah, and it's a very different experience than Angus MacLeod's.
Okay.
So he says, I saw a Highlander, a soldier of the 71st Regiment, now a prisoner of war here, being whipped by his comrades for enlisting into rebel services. His fellow prisoners held a court-martial over him, a sergeant being the highest officer present, and condemned the poor wretch to receive 1,500 lashes with a switch upon his bare back, 100 every day until the number was complete.
1,500?
1,500.
Also, what are the Scottish so pissed off for? It's not even like this is their fight. They're just doing their
Well,
what's going on?
That's a great point that you bring up, but by this point, it is very much their fight.
Is it?
Yeah, Scots Highlanders.
A year into it.
What's that?
Like just a year into it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, so
lay it out for me.
Yeah,
then.
What I was addressing is, by this point, the Scots are so heavily ingratiated and so heavily involved in this movement for King George, because they've got to prove themselves. They want to prove themselves. Basically, for the last 35, 40 years, since the last Jacobite rebellion that began in 1745, the last Scottish rebellion that happens, they've been forgiven. They want to prove themselves as part of the British Army, part of the British government, and so they're pretty hardcore about supporting that.
So are all Scottish people suffering from Stockholm syndrome? Like, is that what's happening?
You could say that, yeah.
Because I'll tell you, right, with having, our listeners just having gone through the Irish War of Independence stuff we did earlier this spring, one of the research things I learned along the way was the importance of the American Revolution outside of this country, the United States, is its inspiration and fingerprints in other places. And one of those places was the rising of 1798 in Ireland. Yeah. And Ireland and Scotland are like, at times, almost two halves of the same coin, right? So it's like, if we're out there rebelling, like, I know the Scots are often rebelling, but like, why are we so hardcore for the people they just tried to get off their backs?
Right. Yeah, the Jacobites who are defeated, and by the time of the 1745 rebellion, that is their third rebellion, right? Over the span of several decades.
And also, didn't Robert the Bruce win? Like, didn't I've seen Braveheart, right? Didn't they win?
They did.
And then they won their freedom.
Yeah, right. And then, unfortunately, married in and had children that ended up being the King of England, and that created a whole issue.
And then
and then Cromwell, and then everything got really, really bad for them. So
really, Edward III was really William Wallace's son.
Yeah.
We just need to go ahead and just say it.
Right? All right.
That we declare that as history.
Okay. But it's in my mind just because it's like, the mid 18th century into the early 19th century, and I'll say mid starting with this rising of 45 and all of its precursor years. This is a really interesting time for the Gaelic and the Celtic, places, because some of them are actively in revolt. Some of them are failing in revolt. Some of them are like, all right, we just got our asses kicked so hard, we'll go defend that empire now. And it's like, what's happening?
That's literally what happens in Scotland. I mean, you talk about the Irish, and this is a separate conversation.
Sure.
You talk about the Irish. I mean, there's one of those IRA songs called The Black Watch. And it's literally about how terrible these Scottish troops are when they come to Ireland and cause mayhem. Right. So, the Scots basically get beat into submission and are. So
I accidentally asked that question. I was asking more in the how is it their fight when they've only been here for a year. But that is a question I would have had you not pointed it out. It's just like these guys are potentially still being, held down by the man that is England today.
Right. Yeah.
Get your freedom, Scotland. Do it.
Many of them see this as this rebellion is completely illegal, and they don't want to see the Americans win. They support their crown through and through, and they don't identify at all with the kind of Jeffersonian or Republican ideals of the Revolution. They're Brits. They love a king. Even in the Jacobite Rebellion, they don't want a republic. They want a Jacobite king.
They're trying to put the Bonnie Prince on the
They
crown.
love the idea of a monarchy. Right. So, those Highland troops, some of them obviously desert, but as you can see in this case, not so much.
Right.
But I going back to those Highlanders that do end up staying, there's years later in 1782, the Marquis de Chastellux. He's one of Rochambeau's officers, the Comte de Rochambeau, soldier in the French army. They've just secured the victory at Yorktown, which we'll get to in a few minutes as well. But he's taking a tour of Virginia, and he's in Winchester, which will famously be a POW camp as well. And he sees some of these Highlanders, some of the Highlanders that were here since 1776. They're still
This
here.
is in 82?
This is in 1782, years later.
I believe this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is what he says. He says, stopping one day at a smith's shop near Winchester in the interior of Virginia, I found one of the workmen there to be a Scotch Highlander in his Gaelic dress, and soon saw several more returning from harvest. These men had been soldiers and were then prisoners, but they were all peaceable, industrious laborers, and I could not find any of them that thought of returning to the barren hills of Caledonia.
Why?
General Gates had several of them in his employ, and they were dispersed all over the country where they appeared completely naturalized and happy. So here you go. I mean,
Stockholm Syndrome again. They were in prison here long enough that they became one of us.
they loved it, yeah. And I mean, Scotland's not a happy place at this time.
No.
It's kind of going through an economic recession. There's people are getting kicked off their land, and there's lots of growing potential in the Shenandoah Valley. So they start a new life there. So the Highland prisoners kind of stick around for a while and eventually, like I said, make their way either to Philadelphia to be exchanged or stay here and begin their new lives. But essentially right after that, in 1778, we're going to start to see a massive amount of troops, a massive number of troops arrive in Virginia with the victory and the fallout that comes after Saratoga in October of 1777. So when General John Burgoyne's army surrenders at Saratoga, New York, in October, he signs the convention. Basically, my army will be paroled eventually, meaning they can go back to England, back to Britain, and not take up arms against America again, which the American government initially kind of agrees to. But the rough thing about this victory is that it also ushers in the French alliance, finalizes the French alliance, right? And if they go back to Britain, they have agreed to not take up arms against America.
But they'll fight French troops over here.
They'll fight French troops in Europe. So you're essentially sending a 6,000 man army to Europe to fight against the French.
Yeah.
So
here's a division. Have it.
Yeah. So they kind of renege on that, and the American government says, we're going to hold on to you for a little while.
Yeah.
And initially sends them to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they're held for a little while in pretty cramped, pretty bad conditions. They're held in some barracks there. And then in the winter of 1778, and I think it's November of that year, they are marched down to Virginia because where else, right? They're going to send them to the western parts of Virginia where they've built, I hesitate to call them barracks, but they have built a prisoner of war, essentially, camp in Albemarle, Virginia, basically in Charlottesville. And the journey down there is going to be hard. Again, this is about 6,000 British and German troops, a lot of Brunswickers. We talked about Hessians earlier. These are a lot of Brunswick troops. And they're going to march through right down modern Route 15, down through Frederick, Maryland, and then into Virginia. And it's really interesting. I just want to include this quote because I love it, and it's about the landscape of the area that I work. The Baroness von Riedesel, she's the wife of a German general, a Brunswick general. She keeps a diary as well, and she kind of notes this kind of beautiful landscape in Loudoun County as they cross the Potomac at a place called Nolan's Ferry.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, are you familiar? Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's
It's right by Brunswick, Maryland.
yeah, absolutely. It's not too far from Point of Rocks.
Yep.
Yep.
So
I was actually going to ask if they had like either White's Ferry or one of these other
yeah,
ones.
the most popular. There's a few crossing points there at the Potomac, but by far the most popular one that you're going to see used is Nolan's Ferry, just because it's along that Carolina Road.
Sure.
It's
Right near that. For anybody who's looking at a map at home, it's right off of Route 28, Maryland State Route 28.
Yep.
Yeah, they're used
where right before it meets, I guess US 15.
Yeah.
Why do you even need Waze? You got Parker.
Yeah.
Just literally, Parker will point to the
and,
map.
I mean, if you're listening to
Yeah,
us while
no,
you're
this is
driving
perfect.
along, through Maryland,
like, just go here.
you know,
Yeah.
this is along the same route where that guy wrote Country Roads.
You know,
Country Roads.
colonial relevant history things down in this area we're talking about. Since we're off the rails here, my favorite
You are welcome.
George Washington was here sign exists. So if you go down, start to make your way towards Nolan's Ferry, right near the post office in Tuscarora, there's a George Washington stopped and ate breakfast here.
Yeah.
And then, like, if you look it up online, somebody, like, went so far as to probably embellish that he, like, specifically ate, like, 2 eggs and a hash brown. And
Yeah,
it's like,
he had a 2x2x2.
Yeah.
it's like, how do you know that?
Yeah, right.
He stopped at the Denny's and had a grand slam.
Grand.
But, like,
And
the
a
best
proto
part of that
Tuscarora,
was...
Maryland.
The best part of that was, you know, having already been highly aware of the everybody's got a George was here sign and almost none of them are real type of thing.
Right.
I was explaining to my wife, we were driving up and she pointed out the sign. I was like, you know, I've never actually stopped there and read the sign. I was like, I bet you it says George stopped here and ate breakfast or took a shit or something. And it literally was that he stopped and ate breakfast here. And I was like, what are the odds?
Yeah.
Good old George.
He does do a ton of surveying in the area that we're talking about.
Yes, he does.
As a young man.
He actually
But,
technically stays in a property not too far from our friend Travis's ancestral lands in Walkersville. There's
That's
a house
right,
up there that he stays in at one
Yeah.
point. I think he's President Washington at that point, though.
I mean, but I think the moral of the story is that George Washington, I mean, he's famous for just sleeping
Yeah,
places.
why do we even have prisoners? Isn't George just killing all the British soldiers?
Yeah,
That's what we
with
were
his own
taught.
bare
Stare.
hands.
Like, what are you even
and
doing
jacked
here?
muscles.
Yeah, he
absolutely.
just stares at him. and
Sleeveless
fall over.
tee. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that I never really think about, but I guess when we have the convention troops in our house, so to speak, they're on their way south towards where you're talking about. So we're getting them like kind of not in the, they've already been split up in other places. They're just straight coming from battlefields at Cambridge to,
Yeah.
all right, that makes a lot more sense to like when I'm trying to envision the route, like how do they get to Western Maryland? They're on their way to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can't remember exactly which portion and exactly when it happens, but I know a huge portion of them, or at least a section of them, will end up in Maryland as well. They kind of break them up a little bit.
Right.
Yeah,
But-
do any of them end up at your place?
Yes.
or-
A lot of the convention army ends up
Yeah.
in Fort Frederick.
Yeah. So anyway, the Baroness von Riedesel, she's crossing the Potomac at Nolan's Ferry, and I just want to mention this because I love this quote. She says, "Before we passed the Blue Hills, Blue Ridge Mountains, we made another halt of 8 days for the sake of the soldiers. We passed through picturesque country, but of so wild a character that it left awful impressions. The traveling was dangerous, the roads being almost impassable, and we suffered beside not only from cold, but from want." So that's coming from the wife of a general. So imagine what that experience would have been like for the actual
Common
soldiers on the
right.
ground. I mean, the leather's falling off their shoes. They've marched, 500, 600
that's
miles?
not a short
This is
trip.
the winter now?
This is now the winter
Okay.
of 17. Yeah, we're getting, November, December.
82?
This is
78.
78.
Because
Yeah,
for a
sorry, I
minute,
jumped around a little bit with the
just for a minute, because I got lost in that we're not in the June or the springtime area anymore. I was like, whoa, winter makes perfect sense. That's when we get all of our rain. It's just in those roads sucked.
Yeah, it was terrible. And they're gonna end up in Charlottesville, and what they find there are poorly built barracks, very cramped. And over that time, the prisoners are going to start to build up their barracks, kind of make it into a home.
And going from Nolan's Ferry, walking from there to Charlottesville is another, what, 200? No, it can't be quite 200.
It's probably about 130 miles.
130.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not.
It's 30.
It's not.
So
it's not a short
You're
trip.
talking
dead
about
of one.
you're
it's a
talking
long
about the
time.
barracks, and now they're building up their environs to at least be more hospitable.
Yeah.
Again, for every listener who's out there who's annoyed that I always use my site relative to conversations like this, tough shit, it's my show.
Hell yeah.
But, are these barracks that they're encountering along this journey, not just at my site, Cambridge, they were in some kind of dingy, filthy barracks.
Mm-hmm.
Are these all pre-built, like in the context of where I'm at? These are old French and Indian War barracks that have just been sitting around for 20 years.
Right.
Is that what all these are? Or like older fortifications? Or are these now kind of ramshackle purpose built for them?
That's a good question. The barracks in Cambridge, I believe, were built for the troops in Massachusetts, but then weren't being used at the time, so they funneled them in there. The barracks that are built in Charlottesville are specifically, to my knowledge, for the prisoners.
Okay.
So this is like the first prisoner of war camp,
Purpose built
for these guys.
camp.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay.
And we get into a pretty tough time, in the war around that time. We've had that victory at Saratoga, but we've also had a series of losses, right?
Yep.
What's happening in the East, Brandywine, Germantown, the Philadelphia campaign is just a disaster for the American Army.
Yep.
1778 is looking rough. There's a lot of desertion from the American Army. And so they're going to start looking at those British ranks. You want to stop living in this destitute little ramshackled hut? You can come and join the British Army or join the American Army. And many will at this point. You start to see a huge number of desertions. Even, from that trip from Cambridge to Virginia, you're seeing tons of these German prisoners escaping, leaving, finding new homes, because the area that they're traveling in is all German communities. Western Pennsylvania, Western Maryland, Northern Virginia, Northwestern Virginia. Western Loudoun is known. There's an area in Northwestern Loudoun that's literally called the German settlement.
Right.
So you can imagine you're in this foreign land for an army that you don't really know, for a cause that you have no identification with. Like, you don't care about King George III. You're just some German soldier who's been contracted by his prince to fight America. I mean, we talk about mercenary. The soldiers themselves are not mercenaries. Hesse Castle, for example, this German state has compulsory military service. So, when you're the age of 17, 18 or something,
You gotta serve.
You gotta serve. And if the army happens to be contracted out at that time, tough.
Yeah.
Right? So, and one of the, what's funny is, I think it's in Hesse Castle that one of the punishments for desertion is that your land holdings get taken away. Well, if you're a 17, 18-year-old poor kid in Hesse Castle, you have no land holdings,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reasons to quit and start a new life here.
It's funny, like you say that. That's something I've always known but never really thought about when you talked about the way we look at the description of mercenary.
Yeah.
Like, I've always known that. Right. Like, but it's just like when you say it out loud, you're like, yeah, they're not.
No.
Not in the way we think about. Like, it's not like every single one of them twirled their Hessian mustache, put on their gold hat.
Blackwater.
Right, exactly. It's not like they signed up their own contract and was like, hell yeah.
Yes.
Cha-ching, gold shillings in the hand, right? Like, none of that.
No, these are the poorest of the poor.
Right.
And what's really funny is there's kind of a difference between the Hessian officer class, who have joined the army, obviously, for their own merit and to move up in society, and for the individual soldier who's just been essentially drafted.
Right.
When these individual soldiers are coming through here, they're like, oh my gosh, German people. This is so wonderful. I'm going to leave the army. I'm going to, marry this beautiful woman I've met in Frederick, Maryland, and start a new life here. But for the officers, I don't have the quote in front of me, but there's an officer who's traveling through Loudoun County, and he says something along the lines of like, oh, the Germans that are in this area are the lowborn, Swabia, or like the guys from the Rhineland.
Yeah, because you destroyed the Palatinate. They had to leave.
Guys from the Palatinate. That's just disgusting.
Is that how you pronounce that? The Palatinate?
Palatinate, yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce that.
Palatine State.
I call it the Palatine or something.
Palpatine?
Yeah, the Palpatine State.
Palpatine States?
No, but I mean, so like that's, again, another sounding board moment.
the Senate.
And when you talked about all these desertions, especially when the Germans really ramp up, I mean, basically from Philadelphia west and then kind of right into the Appalachians, and then it goes up and down from there. That's the German migratory path for over a century at that point. So they're, all entrenched in that area.
Yeah, and they're just meeting more and more of these people and ingratiating themselves with that community. I mean, there's tons of Germans living in the Shenandoah Valley, and so they're becoming friends with them and leaving.
Right.
And so there's vast numbers. I won't say massive numbers of the Germans, but like the largest percentage of desertions that you're going to see along with the British Army will be German.
Makes sense.
At least, several hundred.
Well, they've got the most cultural infrastructure already here.
Yeah.
Right.
And they don't have a vested stake in the war, and
their home
British troops essentially do, right?
And their home country is kind of in economic and physical distress, as it has been for quite some time at that point.
Absolutely.
Right, okay.
There is actually one English soldier, or rather Irish soldier, speaking of Ireland.
Yeah.
There's a young guy named Joseph Yeadon. He's from County Down, Ireland, and I think he's 26 years old or something like that. And he's a drummer for the 62nd Regiment of Foot, and had been serving throughout the Saratoga campaign. And when he's in this camp in the valley, he is offered a position in a new regiment that's being raised. It's called Crockett's Western Battalion, raised by Joseph Crockett, distant relation to the Crockett we're familiar with, Davy Crockett.
Okay.
But they're raising up this regiment to protect the western frontier.
It's interesting you bring that guy up. Today is March 6th. We are recording on Alamo Day.
Whoa.
We are recording on Davy Crockett Story Day.
How fortuitous.
That is, it's just, I can't believe you did that.
Yeah.
Hey, we remembered.
Yeah.
We remembered the album.
I
remembered.
just now
We
remembered
remember.
the
We
album.
literally just remembered.
Oh yeah! Cheers, mission accomplished.
cheers.
All right.
All right, so not Davy Crockett's battalion.
Yeah. So he joins this battalion, Crockett's Western Battalion, to protect the western frontiers. And at the time, they're actually guarding the British prisoners.
Oh.
Which is just hilarious that this guy is going to join
like-
a regiment, not only in the American Army, but the Guard Regiment.
Do you think he knows some of those guys?
Oh, yeah.
And they're like, hey, buddy, and he's like, yeah, this is awkward.
Yeah.
You should sit down and shut up.
And I often think about that because it's not that long after, let's see, it's in 1780, late 1780, I think it's, there's a lot of things going on in Virginia. Virginia is completely in disarray.
Yeah.
Politically, it's a mess. The British have actually landed on Virginia shores twice in 2 different raids. The Matthew Collier raid and the Leslie raid in 1779 and 1780. And so the American government the Virginia government starting to sweat a little bit about the prisoners that they've got out in the backcountry. You know, if the British decide to land, they could grab up all these guys. And so they decide to move them.
And that's where we get more of them.
Yeah. So they're going to be moved up to Maryland and then eventually to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. York and Lancaster,
Is
Pennsylvania.
that like camp security and stuff
Yes.
like that?
Yes.
Are some of these guys that the Virginia government's getting nervous about, are some of these guys Benedict Arnold's American Legion? Because I feel like at some point he's running around out there making British POWs in Virginia nervous. Or maybe not them nervous,
so
but he's making the government nervous relative to them.
So not exactly at that moment. So he switches sides in, I think it's November of 1780 is when when he jumps ship and joins.
I just know at one point he's running around out there enough that he's spooking everybody.
Oh, he does. Yeah. We're going to get to that actually just a moment.
I just didn't know if that was this moment.
Oh, yeah. It's coming up. It's coming up.
All right, I'm ready.
Yeah. So so they move the prisoners back up into into Frederick and then out to Fort Frederick.
Yep.
And then eventually to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But I love to think about Joseph Yeadon, this guy who the first time he crossed at Nolan's Ferry, he's tired, he's cold, his clothes are ripped up, he's just miserable, he's in the snow, hungry. The second time, right, on his return crossing, he's guarding all these prisoners, got a new uniform, got a new job. He's actually hired as not only a drummer for this new regiment, but he's actually made the drum major.
Oh, so he's in charge.
Yeah. He's in charge of training all the other drummers and fifers.
I'm somebody now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And years after the war, he gets a land bounty out in, I think, Kentucky, and has a wife and kids, and like he would not have had
it worked
any
out.
of that.
It worked out for him.
You go back to Ireland, and then you got to deal with the 98.
And you're like, we're still totally oppressed over here.
Right. So another great example of this new opportunity for this guy. So they end up going back to up north. And then in January of 1781, just a few months later, things really break down in Virginia.
Yeah.
So that's when we have our guy, Benedict Arnold, right?
And a dick.
Yeah.
He just stress the dick part.
I looked the date up.
Hated.
I looked the date up. He betrayed us September 21st,
September,
1780.
okay.
Yes,
All right,
September
thank you. Yeah,
21st,
September.
1780.
Bastard.
So,
he's a weird guy too. He's just a weird, creepy
Look,
guy.
I don't want to rabbit hole in him because I do want to do basically an episode on him because with him, I gotta tell you, I have 2 very simple trains of thought which we can say right now, which I think if you really read into him, you might be familiar with this. He is a traitor, full stop.
Yeah.
And I got all the feelings that go with that.
Yep.
But I kind of get it.
Yeah.
I kind of get it. When you consider the path to it happening, it's I'm not sure I wouldn't have made the same decision myself, all things considered.
Yeah, when you consider some of the stuff that was said about him and that final straw, I guess, that happened between him and Washington, and they were pals, he thought, and then Washington
the effort
he
had honestly put into the war, regardless of why he put it in, he put it in. Yeah. But just anyway, we'll get there. We'll come to Benedict Arnold.
He's a weirdo, though.
It's okay.
He's a very weird man.
We like weird people in the military.
It's great, and I won't touch on this too much, but the British Army officers underneath him do not like him at all.
No.
They despise him.
Well, why? Because number one,
he's
weird.
not trustworthy,
and
right?
He's not trustworthy. He betrayed his own country.
You've essentially switched sides twice,
yes.
right? You've left the British, You've left the British and joined the American army, the rebel army, and then you've jumped ship from them and gone back to the British. So
you're just as liable to switch again.
Hulk Hogan has done less flipping in the wrestling world than this guy has done, right?
Yeah. So he does land in Virginia in January, and brings with him about 2,000 British troops. That's loyalists, German and British troops, and they are going to wreak havoc along the Tidewater region of Virginia. Basically from January through April. And they burn a bunch of government buildings in Richmond, and the government's just scrambling. They move the capital out west. All the prisoners essentially are gone by this point, and all their weapon storage, all the colony, or rather the state's weapon storages move out west, and there's really no military in Virginia to fight against him, which goes into a whole different story about the entire Virginia line was captured a year earlier at the Siege of Charleston, so it's rough time for Virginia.
Yeah, I forgot about that actually. Oof.
Yeah, and later in March, another 2,000 troops are going to be sent down under General William Phillips. So he's got an army of about 4,000. Now here's the real lucky break for Arnold. Eventually, General Cornwallis, that we're all familiar with, hopefully Charles Cornwallis, is going to come up from the Carolinas with his army of about 3,000 or so.
Yep.
And they're going to meet in Petersburg, Virginia. And he's essentially going to send Benedict Arnold packing, send him back home, back to New York. So that's real lucky for Benedict Arnold for what comes next for the British Army.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Because, we're at the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
But, it's just one of those, why would you do that? You need kind of everybody in this moment. You might not know it yet, but you do.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Cornwallis was a big fan of Arnold. And so anyway.
Do you think they would have hanged Arnold immediately?
Yes.
Immediately.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole other story. There's a really cool story about actually a Loudoun County man named John Champ. Are you familiar with him?
No.
I think I've heard the name.
The guy named John Champ, who is an officer in Lee's Legion, which is kind of like the special ops unit of Washington's army.
All right.
And
is that Light Horse Harry Lee?
Yeah. Right? I think so.
So
he's set
but if
up
they're special ops, they carry their muskets tactical, barrels down, right?
He's John Champ is actually sent to New York as a spy, joins Benedict Arnold's unit, and then is tasked with capturing him and dragging him onto a boat back to American lines to be hanged.
Okay, so there would have been no real long imprisonment, no matter how it would have shook him.
Washington, this was high on his list.
Yeah,
Benedict Arnold was not liked in America.
All right, we'll come to him. We'll come to it because here's why. Because
anyway,
there's so much to talk about. And there's so many why questions I have. So all right,
my fascination with him was because of the Maine connection.
Sure.
Right? So then I began to go down this rabbit hole of him, and the more I read about him, the weirder he was, and the more I was like, I genuinely.
You're weird too. Maybe it's Maine.
I genuinely thank you. I genuinely dislike Benedict Arnold.
Maybe
there's not many people in history.
You're not alone.
Yeah, like this, people.
I don't like him, but I understand. There's a difference.
No, I hear you on that, but he's just a weird.
So
kind of
Cornwallis
guy.
has unintentionally done Benedict Arnold a huge solid. He says, "Go back to New York."
He's sent back to New York,
but he keeps his command, right? Like those troops stay with him, or does he send him individually?
His regiment goes back with him.
Oh, okay.
His American Loyalist regiment goes back with him. There's another Loyalist regiment here, the Queen's Rangers, which are going to factor in very interestingly. To
the Queen's Rangers?
Yes, the Queen's Rangers.
Like the ones with...
led by John Graves Simcoe.
And Akeem Baudet. Yeah. You know, aside from being the new Alex Cross, Akeem Baudet is also in a whole bunch of Target and Walmart advertisements.
Really?
And the other day I'm buying a pair of pants and I pull up my phone to text my wife and it was already on camera mode.
Yeah.
So I just look and right behind me Akeem Baudet is staring over my shoulder. I was like, ah! So just so you know, most famous Queen's Ranger ever.
Oh yeah.
So those Queen's Rangers.
Yeah, the famous Queen's Rangers. Yeah, they're part of Cornwallis's army.
And Robert Rogers is out.
Oh, yeah.
Long
he's been
out.
gone for a while.
Long out.
Yeah, and just a little side note, since we're talking about prisoners, we're talking about the British Army.
Yeah.
John Graves Simcoe is a hero.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care what Turn says. That's the... I don't, historical inaccuracies aside, that is my biggest gripe with that show, and I have to say this, because John Graves Simcoe is seriously a hero. They have Simcoe Day in Canada dedicated to him.
He's not a murdering psychopath.
No.
He also freed slaves.
Yeah.
When he was territorial governor,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, in Canada. Yep,
Yeah, like
absolutely.
he fought for a weird fought interesting way for social justice,
Yeah.
but like was a decent person.
A decent person, a brilliant military commander, one of the best in kind of the field of what we call light infantry. Anyway, that's aside the point. I just had to make that note. Little
Did he
caveat.
kill Bucephalus? Did he do that in real life? Did he kill a horse?
Actually, I haven't seen the. I haven't.
So he kills Major Hewlett's horse. He kills the horse. It's sad, but anyway. But I like that you brought that up. Simcoe's a decent kid.
Just wanted to make that comment.
Good point.
But-
Good
Yep,
point.
Thank you. So at that point, Cornwallis has an army of like roughly 8,000 troops, and they're going to write to New York and basically wait to be picked up to return to New York. There's kind of a fear with General Henry Clinton. He's the overall British commander. That the Americans and the French are going to try to attack New York. The American and French armies in West Point. There's a threat in New York. He wants Cornwallis back in New York, which is actually Washington's plan.
Until George says, "Psych, we're heading south, baby."
Yeah, he's actually convinced by the Comte de Rochambeau, the French commander, who's actually already kind of made communications with the Comte de Grasse, which is the naval commander, to head to Virginia, not New York. So he's kind of tweaked this plan or puppet mastered his way into getting George Washington to attack Virginia and take out that Southern army.
So when we get to like Eastern and Tidewater, Maryland and stuff, you start to see these, like not even that far out, but like Waldorf and Accokeek and stuff. You start to see these signs that say like Rochambeau March Route.
Yeah.
So he went down
Yeah,
through that area of Maryland?
Yeah, they sail down to Annapolis.
Yep.
And then march down from there. And so that's about 18,000 French and American troops that march south. And by that point, Yorktown was chosen amongst a few different spots as good ground, a place to. I'm not. Don't do it.
Don't do it. Don't say it.
I said it, and I knew that saying it was gonna.
Especially because it's like his running joke on the show.
Ground.
Yeah.
Don't
do it. Yeah, no.
But
Keep going.
But he
Keep
said
going.
ground. He was
Our esteemed guest said enough of that shit. No good ground.
So Cornwallis chooses Yorktown as kind of a temporary post, and has got this army with him, and they dig in. They've got trenches, they've got earthworks dug in around Yorktown. Smallpox has broken out within his army, so I mean about a third of them are just unusable.
Yeah.
Simcoe himself, I think, breaks out in some sort of sickness. So it's just a bad time all around. Not a good time to be surrounded by 18,000 French and American troops with lots of heavy artillery.
Right.
And of course they're covered by the French Navy that enters the Capes of Virginia. The British Navy tries to come down and break them out under Admiral Graves, who's actually, I think, an uncle to John Graves Simcoe.
All right.
Just interesting.
That's where the
caveat
name comes from,
fact.
probably.
Yeah,
Somebody
yeah.
in that family.
So the result is obviously the siege takes place in October, and after about 2 weeks or so, the British are completely capitulated. There's nowhere for them to go, and Cornwallis is kind of humiliated and forced to sign the Articles of Capitulation. So he sends a few of his officers to discuss with Washington's army what to do, and they
Sends an Irishman. Sends William O'Hara, right?
Charles O'Hara.
Charles O'Hara.
Charles O'Hara, yeah.
They got so many Williams, Charles, George.
So
O'Hara. Is
yeah,
what
which is
matters.
not the last time O'Hara will be captured by French troops.
No, he accepts. He's a part of Napoleon's.
Yeah. He's in the British Army and gets surrounded by Napoleon and.
I'm gonna real time look that up because
Italian
he
campaign.
accepts 2 major surrenders.
Yeah. It's
He's not just accept. He's a part of.
He's got a rough time.
All right. So anyway, a bunch of officers.
So under the terms of capitulation, the British have requested that their loyalist troops be treated as prisoners of war and treated with the same dignity as everyone else. And that is the one article that Washington refuses to agree with. He will not recognize loyalist troops as being British prisoners. Now, in the end, they don't end up being treated any differently, but I think it's just he can't call them British troops. And there's a lot of threats to the loyalist troops that are there in Yorktown when they get captured. The French end up having to be their guards to prevent the Americans from harassing, hurting them,
Right.
stealing from them.
Just to finish that, O'Hara's in command of British forces at Toulon.
Thank you, Toulon.
I was like, it's a big one.
Yeah.
It's Toulon.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it is Napoleon. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So
All right.
rough time for O'Hara, but
Yeah.
so at that point, the British Army's sick. They're tired. Cornwallis actually has just gotten a shipment of new clothing for his men late that summer, and so he quickly issues it out to his men so that they have their best new uniforms on to go into captivity, because who knows when the next time they're going to get those clothes will be.
Sure.
Unfortunately, that does not extend to the German troops. They're supplied by German commanders, and that clothing shipment doesn't get to them. So many of these German troops that have been fighting in the 1781 campaign, some of them are new to the army, but some of them have been fighting with Cornwallis in the Carolinas and have nothing at this point.
They've
Their clothes are
campaigned in
littered.
their stuff.
Yeah, they're rags.
Yeah.
And we're now going into another winter, right? We're going into the late fall of 1781, and they're going to be marched out of Yorktown to prisoner of war camps. They're wounded or left behind at Gloucester, which is just across the York River from Yorktown, at hospitals there. But the rest of them that can walk are marched north, and they're going to go several hundred miles again, marching north to Falmouth, so just north of Fredericksburg. Yep. And that is where their force will split. About half are sent to Frederick and eventually Fort Frederick.
Yep.
And the other half are going to be sent to Winchester, Virginia.
So real quick, I want to ask you, when you mentioned the British uniforms that have arrived, at one point in time in our research of our guys, we came across a ton of accounts of British POWs who are wearing things you would recognize of the uniform, the gaitered trousers or just the small black gaiters, things like that. But they've got these white coats. Like, they just got these basic white, I don't know if they're linen, I don't remember, but like they're not wearing the red military issue coat anymore. They're wearing a lot of civilian style hats.
Right.
A lot of the British military cocked hats or the bonnets and things have gone away. Do you have any accounts of sort of these like mixed matched uniforms or like British POWs specifically wearing stuff like that? Because especially when they're about to arrive at Fort Frederick, a lot, like some of Fraser's Highlanders they're basically, the way that we're reading it, they're split. A lot of them are wearing those short coats, and then a lot of them are just wearing just like white workman's coats.
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't actually know off the top of my head where those are coming from. It's supposed to be that the British government supplies all the clothing that they're going to need. That's one of the interesting things about prisoners of war, is that you're kind of being the subsistence is coming from your captors, but the clothing and kind of other vital supplies are supposed to be shipped to the prisoners from the British Army,
right?
As under kind of an agreement,
right?
Whether that always happens.
No, and that's you go back and listen to Rob Ambrose all the way back in season 2 talking about Fort Frederick's role, and that's one of the things that happens is there's what's supposed to happen, and then there's what happens, and they're different, right? Yeah. So, all right.
Yeah, so at that point, the prisoners arrive in Winchester, and what they find there is a story as old as this war, essentially. They arrive. The huts that are built for them have no roofs, and it is now snowing.
Oh dear God!
Yeah. They've marched all this way. They're tired. They're cold. Along the route, again, when they're back in Loudoun County and then in Fauquier County, Virginia, they're tearing up fence rails from the local populace from their farms to make fires, and they're ripping up turnip fields to just get some food to eat. So you can see this is kind of desperate for them.
Are they still suffering from smallpox? Like, is it still running through the column? Or
it's a good question. I haven't read anything about it at that point. I think it was mostly in the early part of the summer.
Yeah.
I think it's died out a little bit by that point. Of course, all the sick guys are back in Gloucester.
Sure.
So they cross into the Blue Ridge Mountains. And there's another great moment on their way to Winchester here. There's this really great moment. There's an officer of the 76th Highlanders, my favorite regiment of the American Revolution, a captain in the regiment, a guy named Samuel Graham, who keeps a memoir. He runs into a woman named Mrs. Ashby. And if you're familiar with the Civil War, Turner Ashby.
Yes.
Who
runs around the Piedmont.
Yep.
Fair bit.
The Ashbys are a huge family in Fauquier County, Virginia. There's a John Ashby who serves in the 3rd Virginia, helps save Lafayette's life at Brandywine. Oh, wow. So there's a lot of big family there. But Mrs. Ashby, who's I think one of the women in the family, it's huge, too difficult to parse out. She owns a tavern there, right at the top of the of a town a town that later becomes called Paris, Virginia, and she sees the troops marching up, and he says to her, "Hello, ma'am. Do you think we could get a bite to eat?" And she sees him, and it's dark, and it's his uniform. She doesn't really know what he's wearing, and she says, "Are you a militiaman?" And he says, "No, ma'am." And she says, "A continental, mayhap?" And he says, "No." And she goes, "Oh, I see. You're one of old Wallace's serpents." So she calls him a serpent, and she says, "One of my sons defeated you at Saratoga. My other son defeated you at Yorktown, and next year they're going to defeat your commander in New York."
Hell yeah.
But then she says,
USA.
best part of this, very heartwarming. She says, "My mother was from the old country, though, and I'm going to treat you boys. So come on in, basically." And so his officers kind of able to secure his men some food. But
That's like that weird early, like, Appalachian mentality that is simultaneously get off my lawn and come on in.
Come on in,
Like,
get
at
something cool to drink.
At the exact same time, they are those things.
Yeah. So they cross into the mountain. They cross over the Shenandoah River, frigid cold, obviously, and they make it to Winchester. And again, they find the barracks there have no roofs, and again, this same commander, Samuel Graham, is going to write to the American commander at that time, who is blanking on his name, American Rifle Daniel Morgan.
Daniel Morgan.
Excuse me, thank you. He's going to reach out to Daniel Morgan, who lives in modern-day Clark County, which is just outside of Winchester. And he says, "Look, my guys don't have any roofs. Like the snow's falling. Can I please put my men in the Winchester church and until you have the roofs built for me?" And Daniel Morgan basically says, "Oh, well, if your guys don't know how to build roofs, now's the time to learn. No, you cannot stay in the church." So these guys are struggling to build these roofs and build another home for themselves, just as those prisoners did it in Albemarle a few years earlier. And they're going to suffer through the winter. There's lots of accounts of German troops literally selling the clothes off their back. What little they have, they're selling to the local populace for food. I mean, it's just an abysmal existence for them. And they're going to be there for a few months. And then eventually in February, move up north, again back through Frederick. And eventually all these prisoners who are in this area are going to be funneled north to Lancaster and York, Pennsylvania, where they're going to be placed in two camps, and I love this. There's one camp for all of the Saratoga prisoners, and there's one camp for the Yorktown prisoners. They call the camp for the Yorktown prisoners Camp Security.
Okay.
Because they're under secure guard. They're brand new prisoners in American
They don't know
hands.
how to be yet.
They don't know how to be prisoners.
Right.
Yeah. And then there's Camp Indulgence for the Saratoga prisoners, right? So these are the guys who are still here, who haven't deserted, who haven't, begun new lives there. But
we're not worried about them. They're not going anywhere.
at that point, by 1783, obviously the peace talks are happening, and eventually they will get shuffled back into British lines and eventually go back to Britain. But just a little end of this that I love, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with our good friend Jacob Engelbrecht.
Yes. Worst neighbor ever, but as a researcher, thank God he existed.
Cranky old man.
Dude, like, I'm grateful because I'm a century or more removed from him, but if I had to live next to this guy, I'd be like, mind your business. Like, I'd be he'd have a diary entry, right? If I existed, he'd have a diary entry that said, today, September 1st,
right.
My neighbor Patrick McGuire punched me in the mouth because he says I pry too much. Like, that guy is so annoying. But
he is definitely a gossip queen.
Yeah, thank God.
But thank God he was. Yeah.
Right,
So for those who don't know, Jacob Engelbrecht, huge member of the Frederick community, Frederick, Maryland, and keeps a lifelong diary from, I think, the 1820s is the earliest, all the way to the 1870s, 80s.
I think early 80s, maybe
80s?
late 70s.
Yeah. So
more than 50
the better
years.
part of the 19th century, he keeps this diary of the events, the goings on.
That's right.
He is actually the son of a man named Conrad Engelbrecht, a soldier of the 2nd Bayreuth Regiment, an Ansbach Bayreuth German soldier who had been captured at Yorktown.
No.
And obviously one who had deserted. And throughout Engelbrecht's diary, the younger Engelbrecht, he mentions how much he loved his father and thinks about his father on his father's birthday, on his death date. Every time one of these old Hessians that deserted dies in Frederick, he writes it down. Writes down the regiment he was in, and that's a wonderful resource just as a historian.
Yeah.
Because one of the best resources to look at about the experience of prisoners of war is a journal from a man named Johann Conrad Dola.
I think you mentioned him when you brought up Travis's episode.
Yeah, okay, great. Oh, that's great. So I didn't remember that.
Just because that name is familiar to me,
Yeah.
and I would only know that through you.
Yeah. So Johann Conrad Dola is a member of the 2nd Bayreuth Regiment. Same regiment as Conrad Engelbrecht,
Right.
Jacob Engelbrecht's father. And I found at least 3 names of guys that are mentioned in this 1781 diary, of guys Johann Dola mentions deserting. I found at least 3 of those guys in Jacob Engelbrecht's diary in the 1830s, who have lived long, healthy lives in Frederick, married, had children.
awesome.
And there's a lot of people in this community, in these communities in Western Maryland, Loudoun County, who are descendants of these German troops. And what's really great is, at least in Loudoun County, I'd be interested if there's stuff like this in Frederick, but it's basically, people say, if there are 3 stones stacked on top of each other, it was done by a Hessian prisoner. Every person, so many people in Loudoun County talk to me and say, oh yeah, my house was built by Hessian prisoners.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
But
It's a bold claim.
What's so incredible about this is how much they permeated the culture of this area.
Yeah.
Throughout their time. I mean, they're not here for very long, but still today we're talking about houses that were, whether they were or weren't, that myth has become a big part of that.
And everybody's got a grandfather who was an imprisoned Hessian soldier. It blows my mind how often during the summer I talk to somebody who's like, my so-and-so grandfather was imprisoned here. And my first thought is, probably not. They didn't stay at Fort Frederick very long, but if at all. But it's just like everybody knows this military unit. I don't want to say they're all like a single unit, but like they know who the Hessians are.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's
Christopher Walken's
my
fault.
last little thing that I wanted to say about this is Jacob Engelbrecht is a hardcore unionist. He loves this country. He is the most patriotic person I've ever read about from his perspective.
Have you ever read about me?
Other than Pat.
I'm like shooting fireworks out my ass right now, bro.
That's true.
God damn it, America.
You have to imagine, and he doesn't ever say it explicitly, but his father was raised in a poor German province, was probably destitute when he joined the army. Right. And when he left that army, deserted, and built a new life in Frederick, Maryland, he loved this country. He became a citizen of this country. He loved it. And you have to imagine that some of that bled down into Jacob to become such a patriot for the cause of America, especially during the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And I just think that's really powerful when we think about these prisoners and the stories they left behind and the legacy they left behind. That's really powerful.
I completely agree. You don't really realize how we're not actually that far removed from so many things because, by the time of the Civil War, we act like the Revolution is so far ago because Lincoln's got the quote that says 400, and you forget that it's like 87 years. It's not that long. Yeah. And and I was going to make the joke, but it actually kind of highlights things. A lot of old soldiers and people in general are having kids later in life. Like, we're talking 40 years after the end of the war, Jacob Engelbrecht comes around. Right. Like 40 years after, and his dad is still having kids. But there it is. There's a dad and there's a son, and they connect both of these moments and what happens in between. The United States is born and then begins its international growth, its local growth, and Jacob Engelbrecht, grows up seeing that. So by the time it's tearing itself apart, I mean, that's a profound experience. Yeah. I mean, think about, we're not a modern commentary show, but think about the anxiety a lot of us are feeling right now, right? Like, we're watching the seams come apart, and we all feel, really strongly, and it's confusing, and it's heartbreaking, and I love this country, and I don't know what to do, and, So I think I connect to what you're saying now more than ever. But I was gonna bring up something I just forgot because I was just thinking about how stressful it is to exist in 2025 here in the United States.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, a lot of the places that we've talked about here are still here.
Yeah.
And just my little plug, if you're local or going on a trip through America or visiting, check out some of these places. I mean, you go to Frederick, the Frederick jail, the Tory jail that stored loyalist prisoners is still there.
Is it the actual building or is it just the plaque?
I don't know if it's the actual building, but the site of it is still there.
Because I think the original building burned during the Civil War.
Right, okay.
But I know that you're talking about the plaques there.
That spot is still there. You can still go to where Jacob Engelbrecht lived. You can
Hessian
the house
Barracks.
is still there. Yeah. The Hessian Barracks. I didn't really talk about those too much
you can't because that's Travis. If you bring up Maryland, he's going to just pop out of the wall,
break through the wall like the
fight
Kool-Aid
us.
guy and come fight me. I mean that's a great point. The Hessian Barracks, which are now owned by the Maryland School for the Deaf.
Yes,
I think.
it's on the campus.
But you can drive by and see this original building and imagine what it would have looked like with several hundred very tired, very cold German troops there.
You can come to my site and stand inside an acre and a half of ground where at any given time there was about 12 to 1,400 people in a spot for 200 people, right? It's just nuts.
Travel down Route 15 sometime, cross at Point of Rocks, and you'll see the Blue Ridge Mountains, and you'll feel the same things. We've protected a large amount of this landscape in Virginia, and it's a constant fight, but we're very fortunate that it's still there so that we can feel the exact same evocative feelings that these prisoners had when they entered, in many cases, their new home.
All right, so for continuing this conversation in person, right, when we want people to get out into the field, come to my site, come to your site, when they come up and when they catch you in the Piedmont, how do they do that? For me, it's a static acre and a half. You're going to find me in the same spot, but I know that your area is pretty vast, and you don't always do living history. Right. So how do they continue this conversation with you, either in person? Do you do a blog? How do you work in this subject outside of just donating your time to our show?
Yeah. So I work for the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, which is headquartered outside of Middleburg, Virginia. Again, kind of the headquarters of horse country. And this is one topic that I'm very, very passionate about and that I've been very fortunate to talk about through work, but it's one of many. We focus on, ancient Native American peoples all the way through essentially World War II, the Cold War, and up to the present. So there's a lot of history. We focus on 5 different counties in what we call the Piedmont Heritage Area. And so we're doing it all. We're in schools all the time, doing school programs, adult education programs, and you can just reach us by messaging us on our Facebook page. Again, Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area. We're on Instagram as at Piedmont Heritage, or shoot us an email at info@piedmontheritage.org. If you've got questions, shoot them our way. If you want to come and visit, we do have an office in Atoka, Virginia, just outside of Middleburg. It's the Caleb Rector House. It's an 1802 farmhouse that we've kind of got as like a visitor center, museum office space.
It's a cool office.
If you ever want to come and visit, shoot us a message. And you can also find us online, piedmontheritage.org.
Well, I'm going to talk this man off mic to see if maybe we can do some professional collaborating. So, visit the sites and see what's up. Ian, this has been a pleasure, man. Thanks for coming out and talking about this. This is something that I love talking about and has been a very eye-opening experience every step I take in it personally. So it's very exciting. Real quick, just one more time. They did not play The World Turned Upside Down when we did all that Yorktown stuff,
they didn't.
Right?
That's a great note. I totally forgot to mention that. They said that the World Turned Upside Down was played. It's very dramatic to say that. The first record of that, I think, comes out in the 1800s.
Because what's the account? Before we do the myth busting, the account is what? They come in, playing the song, and then
Lafayette's
like, that, play Yankee Doodle.
Right. The white flag was raised, and that the British came out with their fifer and drummer playing The World Turned Upside Down. The reality is the surrender conditions were the exact same that were offered to the Americans at the Siege of Charleston when they surrendered. Usually, this is very interesting, but usually when you surrender an army, your army surrenders, you are able to fly your flags, and your fifers and drummers play the music of the force that captured you. It's kind of a sign of mutual respect.
Sure.
At Charleston, the Americans were ordered to have their flags encased, so they can't fly their flags, and they only can play their own music. So it's kind of a slap in the face, an insult to the American army. And so Washington says, no, same terms.
Yeah.
So the British came out playing their own tunes.
Did the British play Yankee Doodle? Because that would be. I mean, it was their diss track originally.
Yeah, I don't know what they.
track.
I don't know what they played. Yeah.
Did you not know that, Parker?
I did know that, actually.
Yeah.
Most people don't know that
I just love
Yankee
the fact
Doodle
it
is
was-
originally a diss track
Yeah,
about how
it is.
crappy we are. But for the record, we want to just address something since you're a colonial guy a bit here yourself. How stupid of a diss is it? Even though I get that the context is different, but they're like making fun of Americans for wanting to like get drunk and like hang out with women and
Yeah.
dance to music.
Yeah.
I'm like, that sounds rad,
Yeah.
dude.
How American is it to take something that somebody said as an insult and turn it into our biggest strength, right?
Yeah. But just like they're like, oh, Americans, mind the step and and all that stuff. It's like, dude, we're partying.
Yeah.
Like, chill out, England.
Yeah, that song is awesome and we love it.
Yeah, and now we're gonna play it all the time. All right, cool. So, all right, look, I'm very, very thankful for your time today. It was awesome to have you cameo. It was such a fortuitous thing because it was like, dude, now there's a whole second episode that's gonna kind of talk about this. We're talking to a guy named Ken Gavin just about what the year 1776 was like and just the realities of this. So we're
You mean the
focusing.
year history started?
You're right, in this country for sure.
Before that, there was nothing.
There was nothing. So I'm very excited that we're focusing this much on the War of Independence and all of its niche little narratives and themes because there's so much more than just we beat the British, which we didn't really do. We had a lot of help in that. But anyway, it's been great to have you here to kind of illuminate that. And
Thank you both. This has just been great.
and we're gonna have you sign the wall like proper this time because you got a little cameo there. Now you're a fully fledged and vetted veteran of our show. So very excited for
I'm
that.
absolutely honored.
All right, so the summer heat is upon us. The Blitz has kicked off. I don't know where we are in it just because I'm not looking at our release schedule, but you got a whole lot of stuff coming at you at 100 miles an hour in July. We're probably going to be talking baseball at some point because we're right around the All-Star break. Let's just say it, I'm a Yankee fan. I'm probably depressed. I'm probably crying about the Dodgers. I'm probably crying about the Mets right now. Who the hell knows? There's a lot going on. So if you want to tune in because we have interesting conversations, do that. If you want to tune in to enjoy in the misery of my sports suffering, do that. Are you a sports guy, Ian? You know what? In the history world, that's not a shocker.
Yeah, I'm just a big nerd. That's all.
But you got to ask because even Travis threw some shade. He didn't like my Rangers jersey I was wearing when he was here last time. So
Hockey.
yeah, you got to ask. You just got to ask. But anyway, catch up with us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by going to at the History Things Podcast. Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. 5-star ratings, positive reviews to help share and spread the show. Otherwise, buckle up. We're well into the second half of season 6 here. It's the Blitz, like I said. So for our guest today, Ian MacDougall, officially now dubbed Lord Ian MacDougall whenever you're on the show. My co-host today, Parker Russell. I'm your co-host, Pat McGuire. This has been the History Things Podcast saying we'll catch you all later.